You know, what happens when a story is just so captivating that science, literature, and society all collectively decide to just ignore the facts? Well, let's jump right into this explainer and explore one of the absolute most sensational and honestly most misunderstood tales of the 20th century. We're looking at the deeply fascinating story of the Wolf Girls of Midnapore. It's this wild narrative that somehow bridges mythology, medical history, and this really interesting emerging scholarly concept known as the humanimal. Ultimately, it's a gripping look at how we understand ourselves, how we define humanity, and the extraordinary lengths a society will go to just to tell a compelling, even if entirely fictional story. So, let's get into it. So we kick things off with a mystery straight out of a 1920s Indian jungle. It completely captured the world's imagination because it raised this profound question. Can a human child truly be raised by wolves? Now, to set the scene, back then, British colonial India had these vast rural landscapes where dense, untamed forests sat right up against expanding colonial outposts. Human-wildlife conflicts, they were a daily reality. Running into leopards, tigers, or wolves was just part of everyday life. And in the Midnapore district specifically, local folklore was already buzzing with these tales of abandoned infants somehow surviving out in the harsh wilderness. This tense, super mysterious environment was basically the perfect breeding ground for a story that would blur the lines between humanity and animality in ways literally no one expected. And I mean, the story that emerged from that jungle was both terrifying and totally captivating. When Reverend J.A.L. Singh supposedly discovered 8-year-old Kamala and 1.5-year-old Amala in a wolf den, deep inside a termite mound no less, local villagers were terrified of what they called a man ghost. And honestly, it's easy to see why when you hear the descriptions of their behaviors. They were incredibly eerie. The girls supposedly sprinted on all fours with terrifying speed. We're talking so fast that fully grown humans couldn't even catch them. They were said to rigidly howl at the moon on a super strict schedule, specifically at 10 p.m., 1 a.m., and 3 a.m. every single night. They had this ferocious craving for raw meat and milk, which they'd lap directly from bowls on the ground. And perhaps most chillingly to the locals, Reverend Singh claimed they had piercing blue eyes that actively glowed and glared in the pitch dark. Now, things moved incredibly fast from there, and unfortunately, they ended in tragedy. In September 1920, those rumors of a man ghost in Gadamari reached a fever pitch. By October, Reverend Singh organizes a hunting expedition, and he eventually captures the terrified girls after a protective mother wolf is violently killed. Then, by November, these children are thrust into the completely alien environment of the Midnapore orphanage. But listen, we really have to understand that this wasn't some kind of fairy tale rescue. The abrupt transition from total isolation to institutionalization was a devastating shock to their systems. Just months after being pulled from the wild, in September 1921, the younger sister, Amala, tragically died of a kidney infection called nephritis. Following Amala's sudden passing, Kamala was left totally alone to undergo this grueling rehabilitation process. Her caregivers basically systematically tried to overwrite whatever feral instincts she had with forced human socialization. And this process of taming was incredibly intense and, frankly, heavily traumatic. Step 1 was purely physical, aggressively scrubbing her neglected, callus-covered sores and treating them with boric acid. Step 2 involved dragging her out of the dark, forcing a gradual exposure to artificial light and clothing. This was actually so sensorily overwhelming for her that she'd initially rip the clothes off in a panic. The third step was a highly painful dietary transition, forcing her away from the raw meat she craved to culturally acceptable cooked foods. And finally, language. Over 9 agonizingly slow years of constant drilling, Kamala acquired a basic 50-word vocabulary. She learned to stand upright, sure, but she constantly preferred to drop to all fours whenever she wanted to run or felt threatened. Tragically, Kamala's highly constrained and partial integration into human society was cut incredibly short. She died of uremia, which is a severe form of kidney failure, in 1929. She was estimated to be just 17 years old. It was a tragically short life, but her legacy? It was absolutely massive. For decades, Reverend Singh's detailed diaries, documenting her life and his immense efforts to civilize her, stood as one of the most famous, supposedly ironclad examples of feral children in all of recorded history. Her story completely influenced global science, literature, and folklore for generations. Okay, get ready because here is where the story takes a massive, totally unexpected turn. Decades later, modern archival research blew the case wide open. It was honestly like detectives uncovering a cold case hoax. independent researchers finally started taking a closer look at Singh's so-called evidence. And modern experts, including French surgeon Serge Arolles and anthropologist M.F. Ashley Montagu, revealed something genuinely shocking. Singh's highly detailed diaries, they were completely fabricated, and they were written after the girls had already died. The timeline of his diary entries didn't match meteorological records. They didn't even match the orphanage's own historical logs, and there was absolutely zero corroborating physical evidence of a wolf den. As Montagu forcefully pointed out, this entire narrative was highly likely a hoax, deliberately fabricated to attract much-needed international donations for his rural orphanage. So we really need to separate the sensational myth from the devastating medical reality here. The myth we all bought into sold a story of wolf-reared girls with feral adaptations, immunity to cold, and wild agility. But the deeply empathetic modern medical consensus points to a much darker reality: severe neglect, trauma, and tragic exploitation. Modern psychologists, most notably Bruno Bettelheim, analyzed their actual documented behaviors. We're talking about aggressively avoiding human eye contact, quadrupedal movement, repetitive rocking, and waking up frequently in the night. Bettelheim pointed out that these behaviors perfectly mirror children suffering from severe institutional neglect, profound trauma, and neurodevelopmental disorders like autism. They didn't act this way because they were raised by wolves. They acted this way because of profound human neglect. So the really crucial point here is that before the advent of modern developmental medicine, society routinely used the myth of feral animal rearing to explain away marginalized children who were suffering from neurodivergence or extreme abuse. Raised by Wolves wasn't just some fantastical campfire story, it was a pre-modern diagnostic tool. It was a highly convenient way for local communities to explain away severe developmental disabilities without ever having to actually confront the deeply uncomfortable realities of human abandonment and rampant child abuse. I mean, it was simply much easier to blame the wolves of the jungle than to look in the mirror and face society's own profound failings. Now, here's where the historical irony gets super thick. Even as a proven hoax, this story accidentally shaped the foundation of 20th century linguistic science. It was heavily cited by prominent linguists like Eric Lenenberg to build what's called the critical period hypothesis. Lenenberg basically theorized that our brains have this strict, biologically determined alarm clock for language acquisition. If a child doesn't hear language before puberty, that neurological window slams shut forever. And because Kamala only ever managed to learn 50 words over 9 years, scientists literally used her as living, breathing proof that missing early human contact permanently stunts speech. So even though the fundamental premise of her being raised by a wolf was entirely false, her tragic developmental limitations fundamentally shaped how modern science understands the human brain. So you're probably wondering, if the science was essentially debunked, why on earth are we still talking about them today? Well, it's because the academic narrative has completely shifted. Today, scholars and poets are diving back into this archive, and they aren't looking for medical truths anymore. They're looking for profound sociological insights. Contemporary thinkers, like British Indian writer Banu Kapil, analyze the story through the lens of literature and eco-humanism. Instead of constantly asking, were they really raised by wolves, these scholars use poetry and experimental prose to explore the deeper, interlocked histories of violence and colonialism. They're asking, instead, what does this fabricated story say about the society that so desperately needed to invent it? Which brings us to this really fascinating concept utilized heavily in ecofeminist poetics: the human animal. Ecofeminist literature uses this concept to completely reframe Amala and Kamala. They aren't viewed as monsters or scientific oddities anymore, but as victims of a society obsessed with controlling what it deems as other. The human animal is this hybrid figure that exposes the entirely false binary we draw between human and animal. Think about how easily society justifies mistreating people once they're successfully labeled as animalistic or less than human. It becomes the immediate go-to justification for cages, strict control, or forced assimilation. Banu Kapil's poetry actually restores agency to these girls. It recognizes them not as passive objects of scientific study, but as vulnerable, complex bodies trapped in a highly rigid, unforgiving system. If we take a step back and look closely at why these specific girls were targeted for this massive hoax, a really dark, undeniable pattern emerges. They embodied multiple, simultaneous layers of deep societal vulnerability that made them the absolute perfect, defenseless targets for a sensationalized colonial-era fundraising campaign. Think about it. They presented with wild, atypical behaviors. They were female in a heavily patriarchal culture. They were orphaned in a state of extreme poverty. And they were highly likely neurodivergent and physically disabled. They existed at the absolute farthest margins of society, which meant Reverend Singh could project whatever narrative he wanted onto them, without anyone stepping in to advocate for their actual truth or well-being. Just let that phrase on the screen sink in for a second, slicing them free of animality. It is a stunning, powerfully brutal way to describe their so-called rehabilitation. The physical forcing of these girls to stand completely upright, to wear restrictive clothes, and to eat cooked food, that wasn't just an act of care. It was a violent, structural erasure of their natural autonomy to force them into a desired societal mold. The orphanage wasn't merely trying to heal them, they were actively trying to break them. They were vigorously reshaping their bodies and minds into a conventional human form that society deemed acceptable. It really forces us to ask some very deep, uncomfortable questions about what we genuinely consider care, and whether the act of civilizing someone might actually just be an act of violence against their fundamental nature. Ultimately, the big takeaway from this explainer is a lingering, vital question about why society is always so eager to believe in fantastical wolf children rather than facing the grim, everyday reality of neglected humans. Do we invent monsters to mask our own human cruelty? The story of Amala and Kamala is a deeply tragic, entirely fascinating look right into our own psyches. It suggests that, unfortunately, it's often far easier to see a monster born of the wild than it is to see a victim of our own societal failings. So, the next time you hear a wild tale of the unknown, maybe ask yourself, what deeply human truth is this story trying to hide?